Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for coming after lunch. My name's Kevin Pilch. I'm going to be with you for the next hour. I'm going to let you know this is a different sort of talk than I've given before. I've typically given mostly fairly technical talks where I spent most of the time writing code, and this time we have no code. So it's going to be a little bit new for me. But this talk is going to be about being a manager of software engineers. Personally, I've been doing that for 15 years or so. I've worked at Microsoft for 22 years. I started as an individual contributor, did that for 5 or 6 years working on the C# team, then became the manager of that team of 6 or 7 engineers and did that for 6 or 7 years. Then I got asked to move to a different team, and so I moved to a team where I didn't really know anything about the technology that the team owned, and got asked to manage that team. Did that for a few years. My boss left and went to a different team, and so I got asked to become a manager of managers, and I managed that team for a little while. And then I got asked to switch to a different organization, and I took over a project called ASP.NET that a few people may have heard of, and I managed that for 2 or 3 years. And then I went looking for something different. I wanted to learn something different. And so in 2022, I left my home in developer division, and I got a job working on Azure Cosmos DB. And so I now manage the developer experience team for Cosmos DB. I have about 30 engineers who work on SDKs, the Azure portal, a bunch of stuff like that. And so that's kind of my background. I've been doing this for a little while. I mentor some managers, that sort of thing. So today, I have kind of a grab bag of like random tips and anecdotes and stuff like that I'm going to walk through. I would like this to be interactive, so if people have questions, comments, related experiences, feel free to shout them out. Those of you at the back, come closer. We're in a very, very large room for this kind of talk, so we'll have to see how it goes. All right, so for the first couple of slides, let's talk about coaching. So I think, and Microsoft backs me up on this. I think coaching is a really important part of being a manager. We have this idea of manager expectations at Microsoft. We call them model coach care. And so coaching is one of the 3 fundamental things that we talk about as something that a manager does. And so what is coaching about? A lot of people think coaching is about telling people how to do things. And I think that that's about teaching. And so I really like to try to distinguish the idea of coaching and teaching. And one of the ways that I do this is with this grid, this problem, solution, and ask-tell grid. And so many people have experience with teaching. Someone comes to you, they tell you about a problem, you ask them questions about the problem, so you get a better picture of what the problem is. And you say, aha, I've seen that problem before. I'll tell you what the solution is. And so you start from this ask problem quadrant, and you move into the tell solution quadrant. And the problem with that is that the people on your team, they don't learn how to solve problems on their own. Every time there's a problem, they're going to come to you and tell you about the problem and expect you to tell them what to do the solution. And so as a manager, one of the things that I encourage people to do is to move from this direction and move to this direction. And so with this idea, the idea is instead of asking people about the problem, when someone comes and tells you about a problem, you say, oh, I've seen problems like that before. When I was dealing with it, these were the unexpected things that came up. How might you handle some of those unexpected things? Right? And so then you ask them questions about the solution. You tell them about things they may not have realized about the problem. And the benefits of this are, 1, they get to figure out what the solution is, right? They get practice thinking of what solutions are with you helping them out. That helps them grow and develop. Another thing that we talk about at Microsoft is building organizations that are stronger tomorrow than they are today. Right? And so this idea that you can't always be the one to solve the problems and tell people what the solutions are. You need to build the capacity of your team to solve problems on their own. So you can ask them questions about their solution and help them refine it, help them guide them in a direction. So that's one benefit. There's a second benefit that's a little bit more Machiavelli, maybe. And so the other benefit is that if you ask them questions about their solution, they come up with the solution on their own. And which solution do you think that they're going to be more bought into? Which one do you think they're going to be more engaged in? Which one do you think they're going to be more excited to go and implement themselves? Which one do you think they're going to do a better job of? The one that they came up with on their own that they're really proud of? Or the one where they came into your office and you said, okay, go write this code. This is what you need to do. Right? Obviously, they're going to feel more engaged. They're going to feel more ownership over the problem when they come up with the solution. And so they end up feeling better about the solution. So first of all, they get to practice solving problems. You get to guide them towards the solution by asking them questions. But they own the solution. One caveat to this is that you have to be open to the idea of people solving problem in a different way than you would. And that's another thing that can be difficult for managers to sit with sometimes, right? You think you know. I mean, most of the time in my own career, I became a manager because I was one of the top engineers on the team. And so they said, great, you're a top engineer on this team. You should be a manager. People may have heard of the Peter Principle, right? The idea that you get promoted until you're in a job that you're not capable of doing. So often you're the one who's an expert in the code base. You're a high-functioning engineer, and you have ideas about what the right solutions are. And sometimes you have to be willing to step back and let other solutions happen. We're going to talk more about this idea of being a high-functioning engineer who's also a manager and how that can lead to challenges a little bit later on. I talked about the idea of guiding people towards the solution that you want by asking questions. And one of the techniques that I do with this is I try to make myself the dumb one. Right? Maybe I see a flaw in some part of their design, but instead of saying, hey, there's a flaw in your design, it's not going to work because of blah, 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 I will say, oh, that looks great, but I'm confused. How does it handle this problem? Right? Then you show them the problem, and they can realize for themselves, oh, it doesn't handle that problem. We need to think about another solution there, right? It's a very subtle difference between your solution is flawed, it doesn't do this. Let me tell you how you're wrong, how you don't know what you're doing, versus, oh, I don't know what I'm talking about, but I think you must have already solved this problem. You're smarter than me. How does it solve this problem? And then they go, oh, it doesn't, right? Maybe you already knew that, but again, this is a little bit of kind of the Machiavelli side, right? You let people own their solutions. You let people realize for themselves that they may have gaps in the solution. And so this idea of just trying to be curious, right? Instead of assuming something or pushing with a tell, try to be more of an asker. Try to be more curious, especially when it comes to assumptions. You may think that they've thought about a certain case, right? But just play dumb a little bit sometimes and ask them. All right. Let's move on to a little bit of a spicy take. This one is about where, as a manager, you should spend your time. Most people acknowledge you should spend your time supporting your team, but many people end up in a trap, right? Everyone who has been a manager of a group of people, they have some people who are fantastic, and they have some people who struggle a little bit, right? And the most common outcome in this situation is that the manager spends a lot of their time with the person who's struggling. And I'm here to tell you that that's a mistake. You should spend your time on your top performers, not your bottom performers. And the reason for this is that, think about the consequences of someone leaving your team. Which is the more severe consequence? The top performer leaves the team because they don't get the support that they need from you? Or the bottom performer leaves the team because they don't get the support that they need from you? One is a significantly worse outcome, right? But too often, managers end up taking their top performers for granted. Oh, they're doing great, right? But if you don't take the time to check in, to make sure they have the support that they need, to make sure that they're engaged, to make sure it's clear that you value the work that they're doing, right? That you care about what they're doing, that you have found the next project for them to do when they finish this project, right? If you're not spending time doubling down on and re-engaging with your top performers, you risk losing them. And you know what? They're the ones who it's easiest for them to leave your team because they're a top performer. They can get a job anywhere, right? The poor performer is the one who is less likely, A, to be able to leave your team, but even if they do leave your team, the consequences of it aren't as bad. So don't get stuck in the trap of spending all of your time dealing with and trying to rehabilitate the poor performers on your team. Make sure that you're spending the time with your top performers. So now we're talking about top performers, bottom performers, that sort of thing. Let's talk a little bit about performance reviews and how they work. Most companies have some sort of a performance review system, whether it's annual or biannual or quarterly. Pretty much everybody has something that they do here. Every one I've ever seen involves some aspect of self-evaluation where you write up, hey, here's what I did, here's what I think went well, here's what I think didn't go well, and then your manager gives you feedback on all of those things. And I don't know how many people have experienced this, but most engineers that I talk to hate writing performance evaluations. And one of the most common reasons why they say they hate writing performance evaluations is they come to me and they say, Kevin, we have a stand-up every day. We have a one-on-one every week. You know what I do. Like, why do I have to write this performance evaluation? What's the point? Like, why am I writing this when you already know everything that's going to be in it? And so I tell them that I'm not the one that the performance evaluation is for. I'm not, as a manager, I'm not the target audience of a performance evaluation. So who is the target audience of a performance evaluation? Anyone have any ideas? Let's try to do this interactive thing. Who do people write performance evaluations for? HR? In some minor cases, yes. But that's in my third bucket of least priority. Themselves. That's the number one person that people write a review for. Themselves, right? So I'm a US-centric person, so in the US, people work, I don't know, 2,000 hours a week, right, is kind of the, or 2,000 hours a year, sorry. I know we work a lot in the States, but 2,000 hours a year. We ask people at Microsoft to spend 2 hours twice a year writing a self-evaluation for themselves. To me, 4 hours out of 2,000 in a year seems like a pretty good investment to step back from the day-to-day and say, how am I really doing? Am I enjoying my job? Am I on a path to where I want to go? I thought I wanted to go in this track. Am I learning the skills that I need to go in that track? Have I learned enough to know that I no longer want to do that? I want to pick something else. I need to learn different skills, right? What went well for me this year? Where did I screw up? What could I have done better, right? 2 hours every 6 months to think about that and step back and say, where am I going in my career? Am I going the pace I want to go? What do I need to ask my boss for to help me? What experiences do I need? What trainings do I need? What on-the-job experience do I need to get? What opportunities can my boss help set up for me? Right? All of those things, taking that couple of hours to be introspective and think about that is hugely important. So this is by far and away the top audience for people's self-evaluations themselves. Right? And this is what I try to motivate my team with and tell them, like, don't write this for me. It's not a lot to ask that you spend a couple of hours a year thinking about what you want out of your career and making sure that you're getting it, right? So that's one. There are a couple of other audiences. We're going to get to HR. The second one that I talk about, and this is maybe more of a thing in big companies than it is in smaller companies, but future managers. At big companies, there are reorgs. fairly often. I think I saw a stat that said that in corporate America, 40% of people get a new manager every given year. This is not just in software development, right? This is throughout corporate America. And this happens because the person changes teams, the manager changes teams, there's a reorg, and so the team they were on no longer exists, right? A whole number of reasons contribute to this idea. But if roughly every 2.5 years you're going to get a new manager, if you're at that same company, one of the things that that manager is likely to want to look at is your old performance evaluations, right? So whether you're applying to go to a different team at the company, or whether a new manager is taking over your team, or you're being reorged into a new team, your prospective future manager is likely to read your last few performance evaluations. And so it's not for your current manager, but it is a great way of talking about what your strengths and weaknesses are, what your career ambitions are, what you're trying to learn, what you're working on, what you think you've already got nailed for a prospective future manager. And so thinking about it in that way with someone who isn't intimately familiar with the day-to-day work, who doesn't know exactly the struggles, who wasn't present at stand-up every day, right? Like that is the secondary audience for this that can be useful. And then the third audience, maybe senior management looks at it to like decide on bonuses or something like that if there's too tight things, or for promotions. Maybe HR looks at it. In my experience, HR only looks at it if it's a poor performer that you're trying to manage out, right? That's the one time HR looks at these, and you want to make sure that you document things well. But assuming it's not a problematic employee, no one from HR has ever read a performance evaluation, as far as I can tell, right? It's really, this is, like I said, far and away a distant third. But the way I try to motivate this to people is they're for themselves. One note on that, going back to the like managing, spending your time on your top performers, the same can go into, or a similar piece of advice can go into writing your half of a performance evaluation as a manager. If employees are going to get out of it what they're going to put into it, then as a manager, if you do your very best to motivate an employee to do a good job on their performance evaluation, and they still phone it in, I give you permission to phone in their half of the review as well. Right? They're the only ones who are suffering from this, and they have already chosen not to invest in themselves by writing their performance evaluation. So you shouldn't spend hours killing yourself to document everything that they've done and all of that stuff on their behalf, because they've clearly shown that they're not interested in it. Now, a giant caveat to what I just said. There is a difference between someone choosing not to invest in writing their own self-evaluation and someone not knowing how to write a good self-evaluation. So it is your job as a manager to help people learn how to write good self-evaluations. One of the ways that I've done this in the past is going back to the Microsoft's model coach care thing. I like to model this for people. And so one of the things that I've done as a manager is before I submit my self-evaluation, I send a copy of it to my team and say, hey, here's how I'm going to represent what I've done and what we've done as a team to my management. Do you think it's fair? Right? A, that demonstrates to my team what I value, what I think is important to report to management, what I think has gone well on the team, what I think is places where the team can improve. Right? So it shows a lot of my values. But also, I'm okay at writing, and I do care about my performance evaluation. And so I get to show them an example of a well-written performance evaluation, right? And then maybe I can talk to the person in a one-on-one and say, how would we, structure something like this for you, for the responsibilities that you have, right? So it is important to help people learn how to write good self-evaluations. But if you do that, and they choose not to spend the time writing themselves a good self-evaluation, then like I said, I give you permission to not spend a bunch of time trying to fix their mistakes for them and write up everything that they left out of their self-evaluation. Second caveat, going back to writing performance evaluations for HR, if there is someone that you're trying to manage out and you want to have good documentation about the fact that they're not meeting expectations, you have to spend a bunch of time working on their performance evaluation to make sure that you're clearly communicating that they're not meeting expectations. So those will be one that even if they choose not to spend the time, you have to spend the time. But for strong performers, for mediocre performers who aren't in danger of being managed out, match the effort that they put in. Make sense? All right, let's talk a little bit more about feedback, giving feedback to people. The first thing, don't sugarcoat your feedback to people. As people, most managers are fairly social. We're caring people, right? I said model, coach, care. We're caring people, right? It's hard to hurt people's feelings. It's hard to tell them that they're not meeting expectations. It's hard to tell them that they're not doing a good job. And so we often soften our language, and we say stuff like, well, I feel like you could have done a little bit better in this case. Or, I feel like, or it seems like, or some people said, right? People put in all of these, like, we call them weasel words, right? All of these ways that people can soften a message. But when people are hearing feedback, they can hear what they want to hear. And so if they have the feeling that they did okay, they're going to latch on to the seems like part, and they're not going to hear the didn't meet expectations part. And so you have to really focus on communicating clearly. And so when I have one of these conversations, I try to write out a script of what I want to say. And invariably, it's full of those weasel words. It's full of indirect sentences, right? And so I spend the time to edit it. And I strike those out. And I say, and like, again, our performance evaluation system has like some terms built in that people are familiar with. We have the like lower impact than expected, significantly lower impact than expected, right? Delivering successful impact and exceptional impact, right? And so those correlate very closely to monetary rewards at Microsoft. And so I try to use the words that people know correlate to monetary impact to be very clear to set expectations. Because you never want people's performance reviews to be a surprise when they get them, right? They should have already heard this message in your one-on-ones well before the written feedback comes in, especially well before any monetary impact to bonuses or anything like that, to promotions, et cetera, right? You never want people to first realize that they're not doing well when they see a piece of paper that says they don't get as much money as they thought, or they didn't get the promotion that they thought they were going to get, right? And one of the ways that you can get into that situation, that managers get into it all the time, is because they thought they gave a clear message, but the person didn't hear the message that they thought they were delivering because they had sugar-coated the message. They had used all these softening words, right? And so I challenge you, it's difficult, but I challenge you to really think about how to deliver a message as clearly and as effectively as possible, as directly as possible. And I'll tell you, people value it, right? Often people are worried that the person's going to be angry with you when you deliver the message. But in my experience, they might be angry when they first hear it, but most people end up valuing it. And they end up valuing it for one of two reasons. One, they realize they're not meeting expectations, and so they change something about how they work so that they can meet expectations. And then everybody's happier. They're progressing faster in their career. They're maybe making more money, getting promoted. The manager's happier with them. Like, everybody wins in that situation. The other case, and this has happened to me 3 times in 15 years, I deliver a hard message. The person says, this team isn't for me. I'm going to go work somewhere else. And I have several, like I said, 3 people who I am in contact with on LinkedIn who say, thank God I left Microsoft. I've been so happy at my other job. Things have been fantastic, right? I found a place that values me the way that I want it to be valued. Sometimes people talk about the idea of like a big fish in a small pond versus a small fish in a big pond, right? And so you like just being clear about expectations and whether or not people are meeting them, it's valuable to them in the long term as well. All right. I'm going to stay on the topic of feedback, but I'm going to switch away from talking about performance feedback and talk about design feedback or feedback more generally. And I just have one bullet point on this one. But it's the idea of learning how to ask for and deliver feedback that people are willing to accept. And so, how many people have ever had a brilliant idea in the shower and they write up an email and they send it to somebody to say, like, hey, I had this great idea, like, what do you think about this? And you get a response that's like, well, you mistyped this word in the first sentence and there's a comma splice in the second paragraph, right? That's not useful feedback, right? On the other hand, how many people have ever spent a month working on a feature, got it all ready, it's, passing CI, you have the pull request, and you ask for feedback from somebody, and somebody says, well, this is the wrong design. It should have been encapsulation and you used inheritance, like, let's start again, right? Neither of those are useful feedback. But it's the sort of feedback people get all the time. And the reason is that people don't frame the type of feedback that they're looking for. Or when you're giving feedback, you don't ask what kind of feedback people are looking for. And so this can work in either direction. There's a couple of different variations on this. I've seen one that calls it the 590. I just saw, when I was researching the talk, I just saw a giant blog from Atlassian that calls it the 30-60-90 framework for feedback. But the idea is that it's percentages of how far along you are on the idea. And so if you go to someone and say, I'm 5% invested in this thing, give me some feedback. Is it the right direction? Is it a decent idea? Should I pursue it any further? Right? Then that's when you're willing to take the feedback to say, no, that's garbage. Right? But if somebody comes to you at that point and says you have a comma splice in the third paragraph, you don't care. That's not what you're looking for. Right? On the far end, the other way, 90% feedback. I'm 90% of the way done this idea. I'm invested in it. I want to get it over the finish line. Can you give me the fit and finish feedback? Can you help me polish it so I can get it to 100%? Right? And so you can ask for the 5% and the 90% feedback, or the 30, the 60, the 90% feedback. I will say, just doing this is useful. And like I said, you can do it either way. You can go to someone and say, I'm 5% of the way through, or someone comes to you and says, I have this thing, can you give me feedback on it? You can say, well, what sort of feedback are you looking for? How close to being done are you? How willing to change things are you? What sort of feedback are you looking for? So you can do it either way. But even more effective is to teach people to do both, right? To ask for the feedback at the time when they're willing to incorporate that feedback. Because then you can still get the change the direction, you're completely wrong feedback, but instead of getting it when they've done 90% of the work, you can get it when they've done 5% or 30% of the work, right? So they're much more open to changing that design. You're able to give them the feedback that they want. So just this idea of thinking about where are we in the cycle of things? What sort of feedback are we providing, or what sort of feedback are we looking for? All right. Moving on. We're going to come back to that idea of talented individual contributors often end up being the manager of the team that they were an individual contributor on. As such, like I said before, they're often the one that knows the code base the best. They're the architect. They're the one who can fix bugs the fastest, implement features the fastest, all that stuff. And so if something's going wrong, there's a very strong tendency for them to be the hero. They can save the project. They can meet the deadline. They can get the feature to the customer because they know the code base. They know how to do the work. They're the strongest potential contributor on the team. The problem with that, again, is that it doesn't help the team grow. It doesn't help the team become that organization that's stronger tomorrow than it is today. How do people learn? Interactives. How do people learn things? Pardon? Challenges, mistakes. I'm going to say failure. People learn from failure. How many people in the room are parents? How many people have taught their kid to ride a bike and said, be careful, you're going to go too fast, you're going to fall? And how many of their kids have said, okay, great, I'm going to go slow? How many parents with older kids have said, you're going to your first big party, don't drink too much or you're going to throw up and you're going to have a hangover tomorrow? How many kids listen to that? 0, right? People learn from failures. I heard a psychologist talking about the fact that people are terrible at learning from other people's experiences. People learn from their own experiences, not from other people's experiences. And in particular, they learn when things have consequences. So, let people fail. Your job as a manager is to not be a hero, to not step in and save the day, to not finish the feature on time, to not make the deadline. Your job is to let people on your team fail. And this is one of the hardest things for managers to do. It's really hard, but it's really important. It is the way that you help people grow that capacity for the future. But pick when they're going to fail. Think about what they're going to fail on. Is it something that's a critical business feature that the company's going to go out of business if it doesn't get delivered? That's not the time to let them fail, right? So like pick and choose which projects they fail on. Pick and choose when. Set early deadlines that they can fail on the early deadline and face the consequences before you have to deliver it to the customer, right? You can support them all along the way. You can have mitigations in place for when the failure happens. Another thing that people say to me a lot is like, well, I'm the manager of the team. I'm responsible for everything that the team does. So if this person fails, if this feature isn't delivered, then I'm not doing my job as a manager, right? So this is, again, a kind of a place where you have to communicate with people. You can actually have the conversation with your own manager, with the product owner, or whatever. You can set them up and say, I'm aware this project is off track. I'm going to let it progress that way for a little while. If it gets to this threshold, this is how we're going to step in and mitigate it, right? So you can set those expectations for people that you're aware, you're managing the situation, you're letting people grow and have the experiences that they need. There's a famous story, I forget the guy's name. The CEO of, I think it was Intel in the 70s, had a new hire come in and did something in the production line and like destroyed a bunch of equipment. It cost $100,000 or something like that in 1970s money, which is, real money. And so there was a staff meeting at some point, and one of the CEO's directs was like, well, obviously this person's going to be fired, and we'll have to hire a new person. And the CEO said, what do you mean they have to be fired? I just spent $100,000 training them not to make those mistakes in the production line. Like, they're going to be the most careful production manager that we're ever going to have, right? These failures are super valuable experiences for people to have. So think about how to support your team through failure. One of the ways that I like to support the team through failure is by doing experiments, right? So rather than having something be a do or die situation, being a commitment to a customer, et cetera, if you can frame it as an experiment, the idea of an experiment failing to match its hypothesis is built into the idea of an experiment, right? Everyone is okay with an experiment that fails the hypothesis. And so help your team run experiments. Help them define work that they're trying to do in terms of experiments. On the other hand, be aware of some biases that can come into play when you have experiments. In particular, there's the thing from economics called the sunk cost fallacy, and together with something called confirmation bias, you can run into a problem where you start an experiment, and then you're like, well, if we just do a little bit more work, it's going to be successful. Or, well, these 5 users that we had said that it was great, so we should double down and invest more in it, right? So those are examples of the sunk cost fallacy and of confirmation bias. And so to mitigate those, set a time period at the beginning for how long the experiment is going to run, and define a success metric for whether or not the experiment is a success before you start. This is critical, because the confirmation bias piece says, if you run an experiment for a quarter, at the end of the quarter, you look at all the metrics, you look at all the feedback from the customers, and you say, well, this metric makes it look like this experiment is going really well, so we should clearly continue with the experiment, right? And then you spend another quarter doing it. And then once you've spent a half doing it, you're like, well, we've spent too much money on this project for it to fail now. We might as well ship it. And so then you spend another 6 months, and then it doesn't deliver any value, right? And so think about this idea of what are your success metrics and what is the time period before you start. Okay. We'll pivot a little bit. Giving people work to do, assigning tasks. Something managers do a lot of the time. How do you do it? What sort of tasks do you give to each person? I have learned from a great mentor I had this idea of using the ABC framework for assigning tasks. And the idea of the ABC framework is that tasks can either be above, below, or at your current level of ability. So above A, below B, current C, right? ABCs. Every person on your team should have a mix of A, B, and C tasks. Why should they have a mix of A, B, and C tasks? Well, the above level, they're above tasks, they're what challenges them. They're how they grow. They're what, some people call them stretch goals or that sort of thing, right? Those are the places where you're helping your organization be stronger tomorrow than it is today because people are challenging themselves to learn a new space. Okay, great. The bulk of people's tasks should be at their current level. Why is that? Well, because those are the ones they can get done, right? Those are the ones that at the end of the day, they feel like they had a productive day. They feel like they made good use of their skills. Below the current level. Why does everyone have some jobs that are below their current level? Well, because the reality is those jobs have to get done. They exist in every workplace, right? They're just turning the crank, doing the thing that needs to be done every week. And so everybody should have some of these tasks. But the idea is they should have a balance of the tasks. And if you use this framework to talk about tasks, you can share it with the team and say like, hey, I have these tasks that are above your level. I have these tasks that I think are directly at your current level. You should be able to knock these out of the park. And I have these tasks, I know they're boring, but they got to get done. So can you pick up some of the load? And by being aware of it, you avoid a very common thing, which is you put all the below level tasks on one person, and that person hates their job, right? Because they're just like, I'm just an automaton who's here turning cranks, and I'm bored and frustrated all day because I don't feel like I did anything that made use of my skills. But it's the same thing if you give somebody all tasks that are above their level. They're like, I spent all day not knowing what I was doing, and I didn't make any progress because I didn't know how to do it. Yes? I mean, you can have the conversation with people. You can say like, hey, I think this is a great opportunity for you. I think it's going to be a challenge. But I think you're up to the challenge. It's going to require you to do some research and learn a little bit. And you can say, hey, I know this task is easy and boring, but we got to get it done. And Bob over here is doing this other task that's boring, and we don't want to double up on him. So can you just take that one? And hey, here's a bunch of work that I think you'd be great at, right? Like yeah, I think it's totally fair to set these expectations with your team on the tasks and say, this one's going to be tough. This one's going to be easy. These ones you're going to knock out of the park. Here's how you have a balance of them, right? If you think it's above their level and they knock it out of the park, then you can say, wow, that was fantastic, right? You really beat my expectations, right? That's fine, I think. Yeah, and then the other thing, this is great for you to be aware of for yourself. When your boss gives you a task, you can say, hey, where is this task? Do I have a good balance of tasks? Am I learning and growing? Is all my day drudgery doing tasks that are too easy for me? Maybe I need to look for some new opportunities, right? So it works both for assigning tasks, but also for evaluating the job that you're on. When you're assigning tasks, you also have to keep in mind that different people are motivated by different things, and different people are threatened by different things. So you can't manage everyone in the same way. Most people, this is pretty obvious too, right? That you shouldn't treat everyone exactly the same, because that's not how you're going to get the best results out of them. Learn what people respond to, what they feel threatened by. Microsoft has this idea of attributes that can be on a scale of motivating to threatening, depending on where they are. And they define 5 attributes. We call it the SCARF model. This is another psychology thing. There are tons of these models with different names of the attributes. Like, you don't latch on to SCARF as a model if you don't want to. You can look it up. But the idea of different people are motivated and threatened by different things is key. So SCARF model stands for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, fairness. Some people, or every person, has a different place, weight, for each of those 5 attributes. Some people care a lot about status. They want the title, they want the pay raise, they want to be called out in front of everybody and told that they did a great job in front of a big room. Other people want the autonomy. They want to be able to choose what they work on. Other people believe very strongly in fairness. They believe no one should have a title. They believe everyone should be equal. Everybody should be at the same level, right? And the thing about this different values for different people is that it's super useful to be aware of them, because it can help you motivate people by picking a thing that they're likely to be motivated by. But even more importantly, it can help you avoid threatening people. Because if you're somebody who values one of these very highly and one of them very lowly, and you're working with somebody else who values that other one very lowly, it's very easy for you to do something that takes away that attribute, because you don't even notice, you don't care about that attribute, right? But to them, it's a very threatening thing. If you take away, one person's autonomy, it's very threatening. If you take away certainty to somebody else, right? Some people thrive in very uncertain environments. They're able to figure it out. If you have one of those people as a manager, and they're trying to manage somebody for whom certainty is the most important attribute, they're going to struggle unless they're aware of that, unless they do their best to provide certainty. Because otherwise, they're just going to yank certainty away and not even care, because it doesn't matter to them, right? So I have an anecdote. A long time ago, I was working on the Roslyn project. I had 2 direct reports. We'll call them Cyrus and Ravi, because that's their names. And we had assigned out the set of bugs that we were trying to fix, and so each of them had, I think, 8 or 10 bugs assigned to them at the time. And I had my one-on-one with Ravi one day, and he came in. He's like, I really hate that I have 8 bugs assigned to me. I never know what to work on. I don't know what's important. Can you please just assign me 1 bug at a time, and I will work on that 1 bug, and when it's finished, you can assign me a second bug, and then I will work on that bug until I'm done. And I said no. But we can talk about why later. It's too long to go into that. But But so that was one one-on-one I had with Ravi. Later that afternoon, I had a one-on-one with Cyrus, and I said, Cyrus, you haven't been your usual self. You haven't been very productive. You don't seem like you're really enjoying what you're doing. You know, like, as much as I hate talking about metrics like this, I'm like, you used to fix like 30 bugs a week, and lately it's been way down. What's going on? Talk to me. Is something wrong at home? He said, just doesn't feel like there's anything to do. There's nothing going on. There's no interesting bugs to look at. I've only got 8. We used to have 200 or 300 each, and I felt like I could look through the list and pick something. I felt like there was some urgency. It felt like there was a problem that we needed to fix. Now I've only got 8. It's like, man, we're just about done, right? So here I was trying to be fair and like split the bugs up evenly and assign 10 to everybody, and it didn't work for anybody on the team, right? Cyrus valued autonomy. He wanted to be able to pick and choose what he worked on based on what bug looked interesting to him on that particular day. Ravi, he wanted the certainty. He wanted to know that he was working on exactly the thing that we wanted him to be working on, right? And so taking that into account, you can manage people in different ways by thinking about what do these attributes mean to these different people, right? And how can you adjust how you treat them based on these attributes? Okay, we're nearing the end. I want to talk about accountability a little bit. This gets into the modeling part of that model coach care piece that I talked about at the beginning. I think it's important to be accountable to people. I think it's important to set expectations for others, and then to meet those expectations. And doing that means that I can be somebody that others can count on. It's something that I encourage my team to do as well. And doing this requires you to be able to follow up on things. It requires you to be organized. It requires you to have a system to track what's going on. I'm happy to talk about the system that I use another time. It's not particularly interesting. It's not rocket science, but it's something that works for me. But I did want to talk about this one little trick that I have, and it's the bottom thing there. So follow-up. Let's start with follow-up. I ask somebody to do something. I send an email. Usually I send an email. I guess these days I send a Teams message because all the young people like Teams instead of email. But I send an email. I ask somebody to do something, and I get crickets back. But one of the things I do, part of my system, is that when I send an email like that, I make a task for myself to follow up on some appropriate schedule, say maybe a week later. Right? And so a week later, I send another email. Hey, any update on this? And I get crickets back. And so you keep going in this cycle for a while, and nothing really comes of it, right? And then I learned about this trick on the bottom, where instead of me pinging every week, the first time I ping, I say, hey, when's a good time to follow up with you about this? I just ask them, when should I nag you next? But this little inversion ends up being a super powerful trick because it's what psychologists call a commitment device. So when a person tells you a deadline, they are making a commitment. And people value having integrity. They value meeting their commitments. But importantly, they value meeting the commitments that they set for themselves. And so just the fact that they gave you a date, A, means they're way more likely to hit that date. But even if they don't hit that date, you send them an email on that date and you say, hey, how's this going? I haven't seen any updates on it. Maybe I missed it. Again, make yourself look dumb a little bit, right? You give the appearance that they're in the right, even if you know that they're not in the right. But you ask them for an update. Now, because they set the deadline for themselves, they feel bad that they missed it. They're upset with themselves that they missed it. They're no longer upset with you for nagging them about this deadline that they missed. They're upset with themselves for missing the deadline that they made for themselves. So one trick for holding other people accountable is let them pick the date, because it acts as what psychologists call a commitment device, right? Once people have made a commitment, they want to hold themselves to that commitment. It's a really powerful little trick. Let's see. 10 more minutes. I'm going to see what we want to talk about. All right, we'll go through this one quickly. So nudges and values. Many people have probably heard of this idea that you need to be careful what you measure because that's what you're going to get, right? The inverse is also true. If you want to get something, you can measure that thing, and you will get it, right? And this is a useful thing to be aware of. You can advertise what you value by measuring it, perhaps, by displaying the measurement if it already exists somewhere, right? And just by doing that, the team around you will come to value it as well. So a brief anecdote for this. When I took over the ASP.NET team, I was asked to take over the team. My boss came to me and said, hey, the team's really struggling. They can't get a build that's green. There's all these dependencies that, like, .NET has a crazy complicated dependency flow system of builds between branches and repos. And anyway, they were way behind on stuff. And my boss was like, I need you to get this straightened out. And so I joined the team. Everyone on the team was like, well, our biggest problem is we can't get builds together. I'm like, great, they know what the problem is. Why isn't it fixed already? Well, like, nobody took ownership of it. Nobody cared, right? And so what I did is I made a TFS dashboard that showed the state of the build and the state of the dependencies, and I put it up on a TV in our team room. And every time the build went red, I stood up and I said, hey, the build's red. Who's fixing it? Right? And I did that for a month. And at the end of the month, I didn't have to do it anymore. The build would turn red and somebody else would stand up and say, hey, the build's red. I'm going to fix it. Right? It's a simple thing. But if you show people that that's what you care about, just by asking about it, by showing interest in it, by being, like, having it be something that you reinforce, people will adjust their behavior to do the thing that you value. So advertise it. All right, let's talk about decision making a little bit. Decision making is hard. And most organizations, in my experience, do it very, very poorly. Going back to that idea of the Peter Principle, I don't know if it's not called the Peter Principle, but the same idea applies to decisions. In every organization I've been in, almost, decisions get escalated to the person who doesn't know enough to make the decision. Somebody's laughing, right? You've all experienced this, right? You're like, well, I don't know, we better ask my boss. And you keep asking bosses until the boss is like, I don't know, do this, right? And so clearly this is a terrible way to make decisions, right? So what can we do about it? Well, it turns out that organizational decision making is like a whole branch of academia. And there are like hundreds of decision-making models and frameworks and stuff like that that you can choose. If this is an interesting subject for you, you can spend forever researching it. If you want a quick tip, I'm going to talk about one. It's one that I like. And it starts by talking about who's involved in decision-making. And we call it the OARP model, O-A-R-P. I actually think it should be O-A-P-R, but that doesn't form a pronounceable sort of word. So we'll do it in this order. The key point of this framework is that you identify 4 different individuals or groups of individuals. You identify who is the owner of the decision, who is the person who's going to make the decision. Separate from the owner, there's the idea of the approver. Who is the person who is accountable for the decision? These can be different people. And that's the key thing that most organizations don't realize. Third is reviewers. These are people who are interested in the outcome of the decision. They need to be told about the decision at the end, right? And participant. These are experts, subject matter experts. They maybe meet with the team and discuss what the options are, right? But the key, going back, the owner and the approver can be different people. So the person who is the expert in the area, they own the decision. They say, we're going to do X. And then they go to the approver and say, I've made the decision, we're going to do X. And the approver can veto it. They can say, I'm high enough in the org, I know about this business landscape thing, or I know about this organizational thing that means that that's not the best decision. So I'll veto your decision. But most of the time, they're going to stand by the decision because they're going to trust the technical expertise of the owner, right? So they're not going to veto it on a technical thing. They're not going to say, oh, blah is going to be a faster framework to use, so no, we're not going to use that framework, right? They're going to say, oh, I know we've already paid a license to this other company, and so it's going to be too expensive to do that, so we're going to use this other company's license, right? They're going to apply broader knowledge that they may have from being higher in the organization in order to veto a decision if necessary, but 99% of the time, they're going to be like, yeah, great, let's do that, right? And so this is a way that you can push the decision-making ownership down to the people who have the expertise to make the decisions, but still have the confidence and backing of someone high enough up to take accountability for the decision. And so I encourage you to think about this as you're going through decisions. Who should be the owner for the decision? Who should be the approver for the decision? And sometimes, often, they don't have to be the same person. All right, other factors in decision making. How urgent is the decision? Is it worth spinning up this whole process? How reversible is the decision? And what are the consequences of the decision? I find that many organizations spend a long time building processes to prevent people from making mistakes that have zero consequences and can be reversed easily. My favorite example is like blocking people out of the ability to check in code. It's like, well, nobody can possibly ever check in code unless every CI gate is green, because the world would end if somebody checked in a bad commit. Really? You type git revert and it's gone. Like, there's no consequences. It's super easy to reverse the decision, right? But instead, you put a draconian process in front of people that makes it feel like you don't trust them, right? So think about decisions, whether they really matter, right? And if they don't really matter, don't put a lot of process around the decisions. Trust that people will make good decisions and know how to reverse them if they make a wrong decision. Anyway, that's just to say, trust your people most of the time. They're good people. I got one more slide I'm going to talk about. I actually have 3 more slides, but I'm going to run out of time. This is a fun one. This is the idea that after a decision has been made, you may not agree with the decision. If you don't agree with the decision, you have 3 choices. You can walk. You can say, that was the wrong decision, I'm going to go find a new job. Can't be here, right? Maybe that's the right thing for you to do. Maybe the decision impacts your morals, your ethics. It's fine. The second choice you can do is you can stay on the team, and you can grumble about it, and you can sabotage the decision, and you can do your very best to make sure that the decision that you didn't think would be successful is not successful. I'm going to suggest that that's not a great approach. Instead, you can take the approach of disagreeing and committing. You can say, I disagree. I don't think this is the best path to get from A to B. And then you can say, but it's the path we're going to take, so I'll do my best to get there as fast as I can. Right? And then you can lean in and do your best and support the team, help them in every way you can on that decision. It can be hard to do that, but I'm going to suggest that it's a better way than quietly grumbling and sabotaging the decision instead. Last anecdote, we have 1 minute. Back in 2008, 2009, before we had a name for the Roslyn project, we had an OARP decision group trying to decide which of 4 possible approaches we were going to take to do the implementation of the Roslyn project. I was one of the participants in that group. There's a Danish guy some of you may have heard of named Anders Helsberg, who was also in that group. He was also one of the participants. The owner of the decision was our product unit manager, Scott Wiltemuth. The approver was our VP, et cetera. So we had a whole system, OARP, all that stuff. I said we had 4 choices. There was a particular meeting where we were debating the merits of these 4 choices. It got a little bit heated. Anders and I, at the end of the meeting, were standing up across on opposite sides of a conference table, shouting and shaking fists at each other and that sort of thing. I'm not proud of this moment. I left. Somebody was sending out notes from all the meetings, these like small closed-door meetings. The notes came out and said, next meeting we're going to take a break to focus on respectfully interacting with each other. They very carefully left out the actual fight that happened. But anyway, it was pretty clear to me at that point that Anders was going to win. He wins most things. And so I went home, and I said to my wife, I was like, well, Anders doesn't want me on this project. It's not the right way. I guess I'm going to go do something else. We had 2 teams. One team was going to go implement async. One team was going to go do Roslyn. I was like, I'm going to go implement async, and we'll let Dimitri go lead the team that's going to go do Roslyn, because clearly it's not the place for me. So I had this conversation with my wife. I had it with a bunch of my coworkers. I was kind of gradually coming to accept it. And then I had a one-on-one with Anders. And I walked into Anders' office, and I was like, well, have fun on Roslyn. Looks like it's going to be exciting. Not sure you made the right choice, but you go do your thing. I'll go work on async over here. And Anders said, what are you talking about? You care so much about this project. You care so much about the outcome that we talked about. You're going to give up on being part of delivering that outcome because you think we're going to take a slightly wrong path to get there? You're crazy. Like, you care so much about this, about this outcome, you should be here. And so that's the time I decided that I would disagree with the path that we took, but commit to executing it to the best of my ability. And so I spent the next 5 years working on that, and it has been one of the most wonderful parts of my career. And so I would encourage you to think about this option of disagreeing and committing. With that, I'm 2 minutes over, so I will not take questions. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it.